French-American Foundation, United States, is delighted you can join us for this webinar with Christopher Dickey about the political landscape in France. In the wake of the recent elections, François Hollande became the first socialist president of France since François Mitterrand left office in 1995, and the recent legislative elections have given him a majority in the French Parliament. The goal of this conversation is to discuss the new balance of political power and how the new French government promises to change the political life and policies of France and Europe. My name is Alfred Ross. I'm a director and member of the executive committee of the French-American Foundation in the United States. And the foundation is the principal non-governmental organization linking France and the United States. Its mission is to promote a dynamic French-American partnership and to advance the values that the two countries represent through conferences, study tours, and forums on various social, political, and economic issues facing the two nations. The most successful program which the foundation runs is its Young Leaders Program, in which approximately 10 to 12 young leaders under 40 years old are selected in France and a similar group in the United States, and then they spend a long weekend together, 1 year that's held in the United States, and the alternating year it's held in France. And that has been a very successful program which has included among young leaders in the United States both of the Clintons, Wesley Clark, Robert Gulick, who was formerly head of the World Bank, and in France a number of prominent public figures, including the new president François Hollande and 5 members of his government. Christopher Dickey is the Paris Bureau Chief and Middle East Regional Editor for Newsweek magazine. His Shadowland column about counterterrorism, espionage, and the Middle East appears weekly on Newsweek Online. Previously, he worked for the Washington Post as Cairo Bureau Chief and Central America Bureau Chief. He has written for many publications, including Foreign Affairs, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, New York Review of Books, New York Times Book Review, and The New Republic, and is a frequent commentator on CNN, MSNBC, and National Public Radio. Christopher Dickey is also an author. His most recent book, Securing the City, published in 2009, is an investigation into the secret command center of New York City Police Department's Counterterrorism Division. Mr. Dickey will start by sharing with us a few observations on this new era in French politics, which is just beginning. He will then answer a series of questions on a number of topics, including the economy in France, France's international policy, and social issues. The people who are listening to this webinar can send us their questions live through gotowebinar.com or by emailing to Patrick Latin at the French-American Foundation. That's P-Latin, L-A-T-T-I-N, at FrenchAmerican.org. And he will share them with Mr. Dickey. Do not hesitate to contact Patrick if you have any technical issues. And now, with pleasure, I turn the microphone over to Mr. Dickey.
Well, thank you very much, Alfred. It's really a great pleasure, and I'm a little bit intimidated by the chance to talk to the French-American Foundation, given all the people who participated in your programs. I think if we're going to look at French politics today, right this moment, there are 2 or 3 things that might be a little surprising. First of all, I think it's important to understand that President Sarkozy was defeated, really in some respects more than François Hollande was the winner. François Sarkozy, at times you had the feeling he was running against himself. For most of the last several years of his presidency, his approval ratings were in the 30% range. And if there was a miracle in the elections of a few weeks ago, it's that he did as well as he did, given what a hole he had started from. François Hollande came forth with a policy and, well, not so much a policy, but with an approach to his political campaign that was designed to be the antithesis of Sarkozy. The key word for Hollande was normality or normal. He would be the normal president. And that was supposed to be in direct contrast to the sense that Sarkozy was really a kind of interesting and difficult character, a man who tended to wear his emotions in public. You could see very clearly when he was angry, when he was frustrated, when he was impatient, and that was a lot of the time. And at the end of the day, I think many people in France had concluded that Sarkozy really was not the kind of person they wanted to look at when they thought of the words Monsieur le Président. Instead, he struck them as a little bit more like somebody from a Martin Scorsese movie, maybe Joe Pesci, a little bit too much of the gangster, too tough, too combative, too much the little tough guy. And all of that's very subjective, of course, but it's that kind of subjective thing in the age of mass communications, the internet and television and constant television news that tends to count in presidential elections. Ultimately, the French just did not like Nicolas Sarkozy, and that's why almost any socialist candidate that would have run against him would have had a very, very good chance of winning. Now, of course, what we know is that the socialist candidate that everybody expected to run against him just over a year ago was Dominique Strauss-Kahn, but he imploded, as it were, in a hotel room in New York City, which not only was a scandal, a single scandal that cost him the chance to run against Sarkozy, but unleashed a whole series of scandals that continue this day to plague Strauss-Kahn's reputation and have effectively ended his political career. So you had Hollande come in almost by default as the candidate, as the anointed candidate last fall. He ran a good, solid campaign. He touched on a lot of issues that the French were concerned about, but he didn't necessarily offer very clear solutions. His clearest idea was that France should not be in lockstep with Germany, with the idea that it could clean up its economy just by constantly cutting expenditures, and that it would have to raise taxes and also find means of promoting growth without necessarily cutting so much government spending. This is not an unreasonable approach in a country where I think roughly 55% of the gross domestic product is public spending. But if you start really cutting public spending in France and expect for it to grow, you're essentially going to dig yourself out of one hole and into another. And I think that that's something that Hollande understood, that Sarkozy tried to ignore, and that a lot of European governments are now sympathetic with, and that's where we get a lot of this talk about growth. It seems, for the moment, that the great judges of policy, that is the markets, the people who buy debt, have rather more confidence in France and its ability to do these kinds of things that Hollande has outlined than we might have expected from some of the punditry that we've seen in the press, especially in the Anglo-Saxon, as they say, press, in recent weeks. In fact, France's bond yields are going down. The sale, I think, in the last day or so, had bond yields in the 1.4 range, which is sort of an incredible contrast with what Spain is paying, for instance, or Italy is paying at this moment. In fact, a lot of money seems to be going from Spain and Italy to France. So if we're going to look at the markets and whether there's a vote of confidence there for the Hollande government, it would seem that there is definitely one, and that's good news for him, at least in the short term. The bad news is that there's going to be a sort of a general audit of the state's finances that will be published on, I think, July 2nd. And everybody expects that's going to have a lot of bad news in it. Now, partly this is what always happens when you get a new government and change the party. They do an audit and they look back at what's happened in the previous, in this case, 5 years, and they say, oh my God, things were just so much worse than we imagined. We really are going to have to raise more taxes. We really are going to have to let go more people than we ever thought we would have to. That's pretty much the analysis that we're seeing in the French press these days, and I think it's probably likely that that's what's going to happen. So I guess that sets the scene, and we can just go from there.
Okay, let me start off by asking what you anticipate is going to evolve in terms of Hollande's relationship with the United States, and what the impact will be on French-American relations. As you know, you're aware, the relations between the two countries during Sarkozy's regime were pretty good on a number of key areas, such as participation in Afghanistan, the French position on Iran and Syria, similar to ours. They've been a good partner on anti-terrorism, and the sort of integration of the NATO command and military cooperation. But there was one incident, as I recall, during the campaign where Obama made some very favorable comments, appearing in some joint video with Sarkozy, which Sarkozy then seized upon and said something to the effect that we're both going to win, which I would have thought would have started things off on the wrong foot with Hollande.
You know, I think that people, including Hollande, understand that that was just Sarkozy. I don't. First of all, dating back at least to 2009, it was pretty well known that there was not a great personal rapport between Sarkozy and President Obama. In fact, Sarkozy could barely contain his resentment against President Obama for a number of perceived slights. On security issues, you know, even under Chirac, who obviously had a famously bad relationship with President Bush, in fact, security cooperation at the concrete, at the substantive level, was very, very good throughout their relationship. Chirac obviously didn't participate in the invasion and occupation of Iraq, but his advice in retrospect that that was a bad idea doesn't look like such bad advice in retrospect. And I think that, that over the years, the French and the Americans generally on security issues have done pretty well. It is actually traditionally on economic issues that there's more of a divergence, and there are competitive issues. You know, if we go back long enough, back into the 1990s, we can remember major issues of industrial espionage, for instance, that were raised between the two countries. But I think that Hollande is going to do well with Obama. When it comes to personalities, I think Hollande is much more steady than Sarkozy was. I think with Sarkozy, you always had to wonder what he was going to do next. And particularly in the last year, as he was campaigning, he was really sort of grabbing at anything he could that he thought would give him political benefit, including a lot of far-right positions that I don't think the Americans could be very comfortable with. So I suspect that in terms of personalities, Hollande and Obama will get along well. They'll certainly understand each other. In terms of policies on the security front, yes, Hollande said that he's going to pull out of Afghanistan, and he is. I don't think that will be exactly a crippling blow to the NATO forces in Afghanistan, and I think everybody knows that. And he's pulling out a year before everybody is getting ready to pull out.
Yeah.
So I don't think that that's going to be a huge problem.
I would also think that in terms of economic issues, the extent to which Hollande wants to amend the protocol in Europe to sort of get more growth aspects worked into that is something that Obama would welcome, considering the economic problems in the United States.
Well, I think Obama's biggest concern is that somebody finds something that works in Europe. And right now, Hollande has a strong voice because France is a big economy, it's a big country, and because he now controls all the levers of power. You won't have any excuses. This is one of the things that's been mentioned many times since the legislative election. But with, his party controls the regions, it controls the cantons, it controls the cities, it controls the upper and the lower houses of parliament, and it controls the Élysée. So it controls everything. And if he wants to, he can get just about anything that he desires through his government. The question is, what does he desire? What he has expressed is, in fact, exactly the kind of policy that I think President Obama can sign on to. The idea that, yes, you have to raise some taxes, and you have to raise, at the same time, you have to be careful about spending. I mean, one of his big commitments is to bring the deficit down to 4.5%, I think, next year, and down to 3% the following year, which would be great if he can do it. The formula he's using is not wildly different than one that the Americans could sign on to, although within an American context, the kind of taxes that he's proposing sound draconian indeed. If we're talking 20 or 20.6% value-added tax, we're talking 75% on marginal income over €1 million a year. I mean, this is scary stuff. Whether you have a lot of money or you don't have a lot of money, which is why David Cameron took the odd position the other day of saying publicly, we'll welcome all those people who are basically fleeing France because they're becoming tax exiles. I don't think there are going to be that many people who will actually flee. But, can he balance it all? We just don't know. And we're not going to see until at least after July 2nd the real list of concrete measures that are going to be put in place and how he plans to balance one thing with another.
Right, right. You mentioned at the outset the extent to which the election in France was really more a vote against Sarkozy than a vote in favor of Hollande. But when you look at the presidential election and then coupled with the fact that the socialists have also won a meaningful, maybe it was not a landslide, but still a significant majority in parliament, do you see that as sort of a ideological shift to some extent in France, or is it more sort of a reaction against bad economic times and kind of an anti-austerity vote?
Well, I think that you have to understand that, I mean, and this is a great cliche, I'm sure everybody's heard this before, but all of the French political spectrum, generally speaking, is way to the left of the American political spectrum. Even a lot of Sarkozy's policies were to the left of American democratic politicians. So I think what we've actually seen is a move back toward what is the center in France. Because what Sarkozy had done, and I hate to keep coming back to his faults, in many ways I admired Sarkozy, but what he did about a year and a half, well, about 2 years ago now, after he had lost the regional elections, was to take his party way to the right. So far to the right that he legitimized the National Front and Marine Le Pen. And this was something that he thought would save him. If you remember, in the early days of his tenure, he had what he was called l'ouverture, where he was opening up to all these different leaders, socialist leaders, bringing them into the cabinet, putting Bernard Kouchner, one of the most popular socialists, in as foreign minister, and generally sort of saying, here I am, open to all currents, I want to bring everybody together. Well, after that didn't pay off in the various municipal and regional elections, he basically threw all of those people out of the cabinet, and in the run-up to this presidential election, he was moving his entire party, his entire discourse very far to the right. The people who signed on to that within his party, the ones who were most vociferous in their support of that, were the people who lost badly in these legislative elections. People like the Interior Minister Claude Guéant, who would say things like, for instance, Guéant once famously said, not all civilizations are equal. It's the kind of thing that not Marine Le Pen, but her father used to say in the National Front. Politically, it was beyond politically incorrect in the French spectrum. And I think what you really saw is a rejection. I think it's pretty clear that what you saw in the legislative elections carrying on from the presidential elections was a rejection of the UMP's version of that far-right position. At the same time, it has to be said, you saw a great growth in the numbers that supported Marine Le Pen's party, the National Front, or now the Bleu Marine party. And so it doesn't mean that the French are totally hostile to the right wing, but they became totally hostile to the UMP's version of the National Front right-wing rhetoric. They thought it was ersatz, they thought it was phony and opportunistic, and if they're going to vote in that direction, they would just as soon vote for the National Front. And of course, as you know, basically the legislative elections are rigged in such a way that make it almost impossible for the National Front to win in any constituencies. And still, they did manage to win in 2 constituencies. Well, you could say in 3 constituencies.
Yeah. What would you comment on what you see as the future of the UMP and how the infighting, which is currently going on among the former leaders, is likely to play out?
Well, you have to separate sort of popular sentiment from party dynamics. I think there's not much question that if the political currents are trending toward the traditional French center-left, then actually the former Prime Minister, François Fillon, should be in a great position. He is a dignified, very presidential type of guy. I think if he'd run, he might have won the presidency. People like him. But Jean-François Copé, who's running the party right now, is maneuvering to really to exclude, to screw Fillon any way he can. And already we see that Fillon's not going to be leading the UMP in the Assembly. And, it's going to be, as politics goes in France, a pretty bloody showdown. And I think we'll see it play out over the next few weeks. I think, one thing they don't seem to have to worry about is the threat that the National Front now will destroy the UMP, that the actions of Marine Le Pen will destroy it. Some of the people that she had vowed to take out in the legislative elections did manage to win and stay in power, stay in the legislature. But the party itself is going to tear itself into shreds, and what will emerge from that isn't clear. But within that context, you have to say that the National Front, or Marine Le Pen's party, has a kind of credibility now it never had before. So the people who are genuinely on the far right of the UMP may well decide that they can start to form alliances with the National Front if that works out well for them, particularly at a regional level. So
what about Alain Juppé? What about Alain Juppé, who got very good press in the United States for his role as a foreign minister, and of course was back in the administration of Jacques Chirac. He was sort of the dauphin, and expected that he would eventually lead the party. Is he still a contender?
Well, he may come in, but he's not right in the middle of the action right now. He may be stepping back a bit to sort of see what will happen. It doesn't help that he was convicted of corruption, and we all like him. I mean, I can tell you, I've dealt with Joube many times over the years when he was foreign minister back in the late 80s and early 90s, and then again, or at least in the early 90s, and then again when he was prime minister under Chirac, and now most recently as foreign minister. I mean, I think we all like Joube, but whether he has the chops, really, or at this point even the desire to slug it out with the rest of the UNP leadership, no, I'm not sure. I think he may become one of those sort of respected voices that who doesn't ultimately make the big decisions or hold the big positions.
Do you think that Laurent Fabius is going to have a particular orientation in terms of where he wants to take France's foreign policy?
Well, it's very disturbing when you look at his record. You know, Laurent Fabius really does give the impression that France and Europe owe him something. And I mean, he really is one of, in a country full of arrogant politicians, he's one of the most. and he is, you know, his record, for instance, on, sorry, I don't know who that is, I'll get rid of him. His record on Europe was that he opposed the European Constitution. He was in favor of the referendum on it and supported France's opposition to it and the no vote against it, which of course ended the first attempt to have a serious European constitution. So, you know, he doesn't come into this office with a great record as a European. On the other hand, he was a good, practical, solid finance minister. I think that was the most recent cabinet post he had in the last days of the Jospin government. So I think he's ultimately a pragmatist who's going to be able to, you know, to move forward with the rather limited foreign policy objectives of Hollande. I mean, Europe is the big foreign policy issue for Hollande. The question for Fabius is going to be how is he going to make overall Quai d'Orsay policy dovetail with the demands, what are essentially the financial and economic demands of France in dealing with the rest of Europe. And I don't think we have a very clear picture of that yet, to tell you the truth.
And I guess in terms of European affairs, perhaps the most expert member of his cabinet now is Pierre Moscovici, who used to be in the European Parliament, and I think he had a post for European affairs, perhaps under Mitterrand, but now he's sort of the finance minister, which has got to be a key role given the economic.
Well, I think in the context of what we're looking at today, of the economic crisis that really overshadows everything else, I think the finance minister is the key role in the cabinet, apart from prime minister. You know, I think that Moscovici does have that European background. And if you think, for instance, to another recent finance minister, the role that Christine Lagarde wound up playing under Sarkozy, she was almost the only minister in Sarkozy's government who really had some independent standing, because she found ways to talk to the Americans and talk to the other Europeans where everybody felt they were dealing with a reasonable and steady and thoughtful person when they were dealing with Lagarde. they didn't always feel that way with Sarkozy. Whether Moscovici will have that same talent, I'm not sure, but it certainly does help that he has that European, as you say, that European background. And he also was hugely helpful to Hollande and has Hollande's ear, clearly.
Yeah, what's curious is he doesn't seem to have any financial or economic background, but again, as you pointed out,
that's
true
not
with
unusual.
Lagarde.
That's exactly right. Neither did Lagarde. She was a lawyer, and I mean, she was a lawyer that may have dealt with many financial issues, but no, she was not an economist.
Yeah.
You know, it's in a little bit, in some ways, if people are familiar with the way British ministries work, with the role of the permanent civil service, it's very much the same here in France. You have, especially at Bercy, at the finance ministry, you have a very deep bench of permanent civil servants who know very well how things work. And if a minister can work well with them, then much can be accomplished. Of course, if the minister doesn't work well with them, there's no end of headaches. But I think this would have enough sense to work well with people who are there.
Let me ask you this. Do you have any sense of Hollande's obvious priority, as you mentioned, is going to be the economy and the euro and issues which he has to deal with not through choice but through what's going on. If this were to get under control, say in the short term, which is highly unlikely, is there an agenda that Hollande has in terms of his sort of vision for France and where he would like to take the country? I must say, from afar, I didn't get a real impression during the campaign that those kind of themes were ones that resonated.
No, I don't think one did get a very strong sense of that from the campaign, but I think just watching Hollande, one important thing to remember is that his great mentor was François Mitterrand. And his style as president, the style he would like to have as president, is of a man who leads the country, but at some remove from the people. Of course, Mitterrand was called the Sphinx, and I think that Hollande is not going to be Sphinx-like, but he's very clear that he's not going to do what Sarkozy did, which is sort of be out in front of all of his ministers all of the time. I think we're going to see Hérault, the new prime minister, I think is going to be, running the government. I think the other ministers, I think Fabius is going to have a very high profile, and although it isn't clear exactly what he's going to do with it, I think it'll be pretty clear that he will be running foreign policy, obviously with the consent of Hollande, and so with Moscovici, and so with the major cabinet members. Hollande wants to maintain the dignity of the French presidency, and I think he understands that you can't do that if you put the president out in front all the time. And that's one reason that the name of his, the reason that he ran on the platform he did was to contrast himself with Sarkozy and using the word normal. Now, that said, he's off to a very bad start. Thanks to his partner, Valérie Thierweiler, and the incredibly ill-considered decision that she made to tweet her support for the opponent of Ségolène Royal, Hollande's ex-partner and the mother of his 4 children, and the former presidential candidate, when Royal was running for the legislature in La Rochelle. And then Royal was very badly defeated in La Rochelle. So the question that's being asked in the French press, and even on the covers of mainstream magazines, news magazines here, is where is this normal presidency? L'Express asked, who's in charge? Schurweiler or Hollande. This is exactly the kind of thing that Hollande did not want to have happen, this kind of personalization of his office. So I think that this is bad news for him right at the start of his efforts. In terms of foreign policy, again, I think there's going to be a lot of cooperation, and I think with the United States and with NATO. I think where you can draw a line against Mitterrand or away from Mitterrand is that Mitterrand was very, very tied up in his historical vision of Europe and who France's allies were. And in the Balkans, untold bloodshed resulted from his belief that the Serbs were the best allies in the Balkans of France. And in the Middle East, I think you're going to see that Hollande will follow policies very similar to those of Sarkozy, but without the kind of unbridled enthusiasm for Israel that Sarkozy often evinced, although he did have problems with Bibi Netanyahu, and maybe not wanting to take quite so much the lead in sort of the second lead behind the United States and Britain, third lead, in pressuring Iran. But I think I think they'll be on board with the sanctions and the pressure on Iran. I think they've already shown that.
A question that has come in from a participant on the web, again, relates to Hollande, his sort of first moves out of the box, and it's in his first month, Hollande made a series of international appearances at the G8, the G20, a NATO conference, and also a few meetings with European leaders. And the question is, what are your impressions so far of how he handled himself in those meetings? And is this a honeymoon period for him, or has he shown himself as potentially a strong leader?
I think it is a honeymoon period, and I don't think he's shown himself as yet as a strong leader, but the potential is there. I think this was very much a sort of getting to know you environment. Even though these were major summits, obviously the various Sherpas did most of the work. As we've said earlier, I think that there was general pleasure in the United States to hear the talk about the need for growth in Europe, not just the need for austerity. There was no real there were no obvious blow-ups with anybody. I mean, just look back at one of the recent European summits where Sarkozy came out of the meeting personally denouncing David Cameron. I mean, nothing like that. Again, I think slow and steady is the key here for the style that Hollande wants to have, and I think that in those international meetings, that's pretty much the way he came across.
Yeah. Another question that has come in, and I encourage people who are listening to send in questions they might have. In terms of his economic policies, what do you think his longer-term and structural economic policies are for the French economy?
I think longer-term, he is always going to have a weakness for public spending. I think that's where he comes from as a socialist. I think that he's not going to be, this is not a new socialism like New Labour was under Tony Blair or the New Democratic Party was under Bill Clinton. It's pretty traditional and believes that the state has a major role to play in the economy. I think that taxes will be high. Services, one hopes, will be good. The one good thing about the high taxes in France is that you pretty much get what you pay for. But it's not going to be. He's not going to be beloved of what they call the neoliberals. He's going to be, I think, very much a statist socialist. That said, there's the potential for there to be more labor peace. I mean, labor unions are already weak in this country, and they're not going to fight his government if it decides to take certain measures that they might not think are good ones for various ideological or labor reasons. But I don't think he's going to take any radical positions. One thing that's worrisome, I mean, if you believe, as I think most Americans and most people in Britain and now the governments of Spain and Italy believe, that the best way to get people hired is to make it easy to fire them. One of the first things that that this government is doing is focusing on making it much harder and much more expensive to fire people. You know, the socialists sometimes really do sort of slip into fantasy land, especially on labor issues, as they did, for instance, with the 35-hour work week, which has all become one huge convoluted labyrinth of regulations. And I think all of that is a risk here. On the other hand, France, you know, is a great place for foreign direct investment. It's very solid and stable, and one of the reasons it's solid and stable is because it has this kind of social safety net that keeps people from getting too poor, too violent, too restive, and keeps the country, generally speaking, very much at peace.
I didn't get the sense that there was a lot of discussion of the 35-hour work week during the campaign. Has that issue somewhat got...
Yeah, well, you know what happened? You know what happened is that Sarkozy ran against it in 2007 and then didn't do away with it. He tinkered with it. He made it possible to get more overtime and to be taxed less on your overtime. And as I say, it's a real labyrinth of regulations. It's a real mess. The 35-hour week, the 35-hour work week, it was stupid and hypocritical, cynical. Not just hypocritical, cynical to begin with when the socialists brought it in 97. But France has gotten used to it, and nobody's doing away with it. Certainly not Hollande.
Again, a listener's question in terms of Hollande's agenda and priorities, his social promises on social issues such as gay marriage, immigration reform, relations with Muslims, will those priorities be pushed aside because of the economic problems he's going to have to focus on? Or
No, I don't think so. I think that that the Socialist Party generally and Hollande specifically are very sincere in their desire to be more open on these issues. I mean, also you have to remember that what are they coming after? They're coming after a government that started raising the question of whether people who've been naturalized as French, which is supposed to be sort of the holy grail of integration in this country, could have that naturalization taken away from them if they committed certain crimes. And that's just not, in the French context, that's just inconceivable. But Sarkozy was recommending that kind of thing over the last couple of years. No, Hollande, I think, generally wants to find ways to embrace immigrants. I think he's open, certainly, to the Muslim culture in this country. I think he wants them to be more French, but I don't think, you know, you don't hear from the socialists any of the sort of thinly disguised code language for sort of ethnocentric and racist attitudes that you had with Sarkozy. I think, you know, you will have a lot of that from Le Pen and maybe from some people in the UMP who are continuing to drift in the direction of the National Front. But that's not a winning strategy right now. And even as there is discontent, people are not actually blaming the immigrants. The problem with immigrants is the lack of integration. And that is a deep problem here because of course, officially everybody's integrated, but unofficially, you know, it's just there are huge gaps. People can't ask you your religion, but they can read your name. And they can even look at what postal district you come from and decide they don't like you for those reasons, when really what all that means is that you're an Arab or an African, or of Arab or African descent. I think that's the kind of thing that the socialists are very well aware of and that they want to try and alleviate. And the response of Sarkozy and the right wing has been to sort of talk as if they could solve that problem even with deportations, when in fact that's wildly unrealistic.
And do you think that during the period before these policies sort of take a more concrete form, there will be sort of a calm and wait-and-see attitude, particularly in the banlieue?
Oh yeah, I think the banlieue voted overwhelmingly for the socialists, and I don't expect that we're going to see many problems in the banlieue in the near future. I mean, you know, there are a lot of unemployed kids out there. Youth unemployment in France is 22.5%, much, much higher than the overall unemployment, which is 10%. So you've got a lot of kids with nothing to do, and that's always a difficult situation. But I think that they know that the socialists are more likely to be their friends than the UNP or the National Front.
Right. Well, I think we've run out of time, and I want to thank you, Christopher Dickey, for your excellent comments, and I think this was a very elucidating and worthwhile discussion of French issues and really got down below the surface. As a head of Newsweek's bureau over there, I'm sure you're aware that the coverage of French politics by the press in the United States is not as extensive as some of us would wish that it were, but you have certainly helped fill in that vacuum that exists. Let me mention for others who are listening that the French American Foundation will soon publish a guide to the French government explaining how it's structured and organized, and including how the existing administration of Hollande has been set up. And if you're not on our mailing list, send us an email so that we can add your name to the list. And Christopher, I'll give you a opportunity for a parting comment or shot.
No, it's a great pleasure, precisely because we don't get a chance to write or talk too much about this in an American context or in the context of American viewers and listeners and readers. It's great to be able to get into some of a little bit deep into the weeds of French politics and talk about the dynamics here, because this is, you know, an extremely important country, and these are important changes in its government. And Europe, I think, as we've heard President Obama saying recently, you know, in many ways, Europe is going to have a major, major impact on the immediate future of the United States of America, and France is having a major impact on Europe.
Including his future.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, of course, you know, Mitt Romney spent some time here, so maybe he'll have a special. He was here as a Mormon missionary when he was young, so maybe he'll have a special feel for things.
But he doesn't tell anybody he knows how to speak French.
No, God knows. Then he'd go the way of John Kerry, I guess.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and this ends our webinar.
Okay, thanks a lot, Alfred. Bye-bye.